So thank you everyone for attending this presentation tonight. And it's the final session, as you know, and it's the final session of our conference, Iconographies of the Holocaust, Visual Representations and Migrating Materialities of War and Genocide since 1945. Giving the plenary presentation is Stephen Naron, the director of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, who will speak on the Fortunoff Archive, Promise and Foreboding in the Digital Age. Stephen has worked as an archivist librarian since 2003, when he received his Master of Science in Information Systems from the University of Texas, Austin. He pursued a Master's in Jewish History and Jewish Studies at the Freie Universitaet Berlin and the Center for Research on Antisemitism at the Technical University of Berlin. He's worked at the Fortunoff Archive for more than 12 years, starting as an archivist, and now as the director, he works within the wider research community to share access to the collection through access site programming, as well as writing and presenting on testimony for conferences, as he's doing today, symposiums and class sessions inside and outside Yale. Stephen is also responsible for spearheading initiatives such as preservation and digital access to the Fortunoff collection, cooperative projects with other testimony collections, oversight of fellowship and research programming, and the production of podcasts, ethnomusicological recordings, and the Archive's documentary film series. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Okay, thanks. Everybody hear me? Wow, we're at the end. Thanks for sticking around, yeah? So, I'm going to get started right away. So, most of you know what the Fortunoff Video Archive is, but I'm going to give a little bit of background first. So, the collection consists of more than 4,400 testimonies of survivors and witnesses to the Holocaust, Jews, Sinti and Roma, resistance fighters and partisans, Allied soldiers who liberated the camps, people who worked in DP camps after the war. Our testimonies have been recorded in more than 15 different languages in more than a dozen countries with the help of more than 30 affiliated projects. These projects stretch from Buenos Aires to Brussels, from Bratislava to Tel Aviv. The Fortunoff Archive is the oldest still active project to record the life stories of Holocaust survivors on videotape in the world. And we're still recording testimonies at Yale Studio in New Haven. In fact, we recorded our last testimony in 2023 with a woman from Sarny. So obviously, for demographic reasons, these tapings are becoming much less common. And while the archive has been at Yale for more than 40 years, in fact, we're celebrating our 45th anniversary of the first recording this year, it didn't start as a Yale project. Rather, it started as a local grassroots effort by survivors for survivors in New Haven. It came to Yale thanks to the efforts of Jeffrey Hartman, you see here, along with Dori Laub and Willie Rosenberg. And Jeffrey was a professor of comparative literature at Yale and was the strongest advocate for the project's inclusion in the Yale University Library. In addition, Jeffrey's wife, Renee, was one of the first 4 witnesses recorded by the project in May of 1979. That project was called the Holocaust Survivors Film Project. That was the original name of this effort, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So Jeffrey brought the first 183 recordings from this predecessor organization, the HSFP, in 1981, deposited at Yale. We opened our doors to the public and have been working ever since. This development, I would argue, this archive, would help transform how we all approach researching the Holocaust and eventually, I think, have a major impact on Holocaust historiography. For the first time, an academic organization, a prestigious university, embraced video testimonies of survivors as an essential source for research and education. I'd like to show a clip. We are a video archive, after all, so I brought it. Since everyone's already exhausted from the conference. This is the first clip from a film. It's called Those Who Were There, and it was produced in 1982 prior to the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, which brought together nearly 20,000 survivors in Washington, D.C. in 1983. Since this is a conference on iconographies, I'd argue that the 83 gathering of survivors in D.C. was really an iconic moment in the development of an organized, public, survivor-driven form of national commemoration in the United States. And the Fortunoff Video Archive was there. The film, as you will see, is designed or was designed to encourage survivors to step forward and give testimony, and in fact, several testimonies were recorded at the gathering in '83. It's really a fascinating document and takes us back to a time long ago, before there were Holocaust museums and memorials in every city in the United States, before the USHMM was built on the National Mall with all of its heavy symbolic value.
Yale University has therefore done a very important deed in undertaking a project to record and videotape using this remarkable technology hitherto unavailable. Record and videotape. These interviews enable us to glimpse into the world of the Hitlerian inferno through the eyes of the victims.
Actually, it's a paradox. What survivors have to say, nobody else can say. They don't want to say it, and yet they feel they have to say it. Only those who were there will ever know what it was. You, who were not there, will never know.
Put us in cattle cars, and they pushed in I don't know how many people, but they really wanted us to die. And we were in those wagons. I don't know how many people were there, but my brother died in my arms. My younger brother was. And my husband's two sisters. There was not enough oxygen for all those people. And they kept us in those wagons for days. They wanted us to die in the wagons. I myself had a heart attack last year. And while I was laying in the hospital, I was thinking about my life, about what I went through. It's like I lived in two worlds. In a little world and a nightmare world. But the people who survived had enough strength. They really did, otherwise they wouldn't be here. And though it is difficult to talk about you losing your whole family, being left alone, what is the purpose of your life, what is it, how such cruelty can happen to all of us, to mankind, I do feel that it was a worthwhile experience, and I feel good about doing it. And I would recommend to all the survivors that they should step forward and offer their testimony.
During the next 5 years, the great urgency is to video record the survivors. There will be a time when the documentation center, while it can never be complete, will have many such testimonies. And we must now already think about the fact that the documentation center should become an educational institute.
And to you who were there, I know how difficult it is to speak. You have children, you have friends, and you don't want to open wounds. Why should you? But you must. When you choose not to speak, your story will not be told, not even in silence. Speak you must. You are more than a witness. You are 100 witnesses. You belong to a very special minority, a minority that soon will be totally gone. And with you or with me, that part of the story will be gone too.
So we started the workshop with James Young's presentation on memorials, and considering this, and in light of the papers we heard on the forensic turn yesterday, I think I should mention that different forms of memorialization are quite fluid in their materiality. A poem can inspire a monument a poem, or in our case, at the Video Archive, a monument a film. One of the founders of the archive, Laurel Vlock, a local television personality, reporter, was inspired by the construction of this memorial in New Haven in 1977. She wanted to create a film based on a film about the survivors the group of survivors who were behind this memorial, who helped construct it. Now, this is an unusual thing, and I'm glad James isn't here to correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as I know, this monument, which is on Whaley Avenue, was the first Holocaust memorial built on public land in the United States. Of course, there were many memorials and private property, and synagogues and cemeteries, but this was the first time that a mayor of a town, mayor of New Haven, put aside a piece of public land specifically for the construction of a Holocaust memorial. It also contains earth and ashes from the camps, which, as we heard, was a common practice. But most importantly, this structure is a testament to the resilience, the ingenuity, and the sheer organizational tenacity of a collective of Holocaust survivors in New Haven. And many of those survivors who helped organize and raise the funds to construct this memorial would become the leaders, the volunteers, and the participants in the Holocaust Survivors Film Project. For instance, one of the first survivors, recorded in May of '79, was Sally Horowitz, who was also one of the key leaders behind this effort. So when Vlock decided she wanted to record testimonies with survivors and create this documentary film, she herself, not a survivor, and had no organic connection to the community. So she turned to Dori Laub, a survivor from Chernowitz, and he was the conduit to the survivor community, or one of them, and he was also a psychiatrist and analyst. Let's listen to him directly explain this sort of early period, how it began.
The idea of videotaping is really thanks to Laurel Vlock. I wanted to record, but I didn't have a clear idea. And video was just at that time becoming much more popular and technically affordable. In 1979, I think it was sometimes in the spring, Laurel contacted me and asked me to give an interview for Yom HaShoah about my life. I knew of her work. I watched the program on Jelly Kozinski, so I was familiar with her approach. And not long before that, I was on television, the series Holocaust. I do not remember at this moment who was the producer, but it was very annoying to other survivors and to me. And I said to Laurel, I would be only willing to be interviewed if we think of interviewing many survivors and perhaps producing a movie like The Sorrow and the Pity. I don't think that I didn't think that she took me seriously. And to my great surprise, a few months later, there was a phone call. I have a crew for tonight. Can you get space and can you get survivors? I mean, in the media, everything is 1, 2, 3. There's not planning. And one thing led to another, and then I realized that we didn't have to ask questions. We simply had to allow survivors to speak and to keep a time frame so that they wouldn't go back and forth, but continuing with the story. And I think already after Eva Bender, we realized that this is something that more than we expected. I assume that the interview was probably an hour or so. We thought that this was the length of an interview, so we tried to keep it within a certain framework. It was probably a little more than an hour, but as it proceeds to the evening, we were more and more astonished.
So that's May 2nd, 1979.
When was it from, though, his recollection?
I think it's 2016. I have to I can tell you later. So, okay, enough background. Let's jump right into the real topic of this presentation, which is foreboding. I'm currently working as a visiting research fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, and I live 2 blocks away from Freud's apartment in the Berggasse. So foreboding seems really is in the air. Initially, I wanted to title this talk something like Testimonies und das Unbehagen der digitalen Kultur, but I decided that would be strange and pretentious. So we went with Promise and Foreboding. But Freud's Unbehagen, which is really one of my favorite texts by him, with its brooding, pessimistic meditation on human progress in the wake of World War I, is a mood that really doesn't feel so out of place right now for many reasons. In the German word Unbehagen, unease, discomfort, is a pretty ideal description of the Fortunoff Video Archive's embrace of the digital age. Deep discomfort, reines Unbehagen. And as study after study piles up about the digital world we've built, its negative impact on mental health, the threat it poses to democracy, the very concept of truth itself, deepfakes and AI, I can't say that I don't wonder sometimes if we would have been better off keeping the Fortunoff Video Archive collection safe and protected within the confines of the neo-Gothic charm of Yale University Library's reading room. Nevertheless, despite this discomfort, we had no option but to migrate our materiality into the digital age. If we did not digitize this entire collection for preservation purposes, the archive would simply cease to exist. Talking about materiality, videotapes deteriorate over time, and legacy, more importantly, legacy video machines are almost extinct at this point. So even if you have the tapes, how will you play them back? After all, remember, video is not like film. You can't hold it up to the light and see it without any sort of machinery. It's magnetic media. So digitization was essential, and digitization does, of course, open up possibilities regarding use and access. One that I embraced wholeheartedly, and which also explains my current tenure in Vienna, is that digitization allows us to take these once analog materials and more easily return them to the communities from whence they originated. These testimonies as life stories are an enormous repository of the memory of European Jewry, both pre-war, wartime, and post-war, all stored, cataloged, and used at Yale, far from the scene of the crimes. Of course, as Young noted in his keynote, the history of European Jewry is now understood as part of American history due to the immigration of survivors, but still, fragments of the cultural heritage of Jewish Warsaw, of Jewish Salonika, are all held on videotape miles and miles away in an archive in New Haven. But now, liberated from their media, these videotapes aren't, and of course these videotapes aren't exactly the Elgin marbles here, but I think it is a question of cultural patrimony nonetheless to bring these materials back to the places where they originated, so they can be used in teaching and research at a local level. And here we get to another meaning of the workshop's title, Migrating Materialities. An example. In 2022, I attended the 80th anniversary of the notorious raid in Novi Sad, Serbia. The raid, which took place on 3 freezing days in January of '42, was a horrific crime in which Hungarian gendarmes and their supporters murdered thousands of Jews and Roma and Serbs, bringing them into a beach in the Danube, shooting them, and throwing their bodies into a hole in the ice. The Fortunoff Archive holds over a dozen testimonies of survivors that either barely survived this raid or had family members who did not survive. I showed a clip in English of a woman whose family was rounded up in the raid, but then released. In the audience was a Jewish citizen of Novi Sad. He came up to me after the presentation quite emotional and told me that members of this family still live in the region, and that it moved him deeply that somehow, somewhere, far away, there was an institution preserving these materials containing the memory of the destruction of Jewish Novi Sad. So these testimonies, whether in Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, in German, or Polish, need to be placed back in the hands of the researchers and educators and the communities who need them to write and teach the history of Jewish life and death in their communities. And moments like these in Novi Sad have convinced me that digitization is worth all the tsuris it brings. And believe me, it brings a lot of tsuris. So while digitization opens new possibilities, it presents challenges. In this context, it's important to underscore the origins of the Fortunoff Video Archive as an organization founded by and for survivors. We made a commitment to uphold an ethical approach to recording and using testimony that places the survivors' needs at the center of our policies and procedures. And we do our best to maintain that obligation in the digital age as well. The survivors who gave testimony, often at great emotional cost, entrusted something fragile to us. And while they did sign a legal release form providing the archive with copyright, they could never have imagined a world or the possibility of the internet, which is essentially a means of broadcasting their testimony to everyone anywhere on the planet 24 hours a day. So we have a fairly restrictive means of accessing the collection. It's only available at specific access sites around the world, of which there are around 200 now, usually institutions of higher learning, research centers, museums. This approach requires us to reflect that just because something is technologically possible, it doesn't mean that it should necessarily be done. For instance, in his chapter, The Ethics of the Algorithm, Todd Pressner asks whether it is appropriate to subject testimony to computational analysis. He posits that it could be viewed as, and I quote, dehumanizing, and even worse, might even partake in the same rationalized logic of modernity that Zygmunt Bauman identified in his seminal work, Modernity and the Holocaust, as the condition of possibility for genocide, namely the impulse to quantify, modularize, distantiate, technify, and bureaucratize the subjective individuality of human experience. In other words, are the digital and the computational at loggerheads with the ethical, and if not, what might ethical modes of computation look like in terms of digital interfaces, databases, and data visualizations? Well, I don't have the answers to all of Pressner's questions, some kind of 10 commandments for avoiding what I call the digital inhumanities, but I think the value of certain tech projects are highly ambiguous at best. Many of the virtual reality programs I've encountered over the years would certainly make Bauman roll in his grave. One example that I'd like to think about a little bit together with you is the USC Shoah Foundation's Dimensions and Testimony project, previously known as New Dimensions and Testimony, previously referred to pejoratively as holograms. And if anyone isn't familiar with this technology, I'd recommend a great short doc by Davina Pardo on the New York Times website. I think it's called 116 Cameras. Very short documentary. So this was really conceived as a new form of testimony for the 21st century. It ostensibly offers us, in the role of the user, the opportunity to have a conversation with an AI-like manifestation of a Holocaust survivor. This technology was developed by the USC Shoah Foundation together with a computer science and AI research unit at USC called the Institute for Creative Technologies. The unit initially received funding from DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense's research division. And according to Noah Schenker and Dan Leppard, who've been researching and writing a lot about this, this technology was originally developed for U.S. military training in Afghanistan and later for use as virtual psychotherapy to treat soldiers with PTSD. Survivors who participate in these testimonies sit in a specially designed space with dozens of cameras that allow for the capture of a virtual human figure. They are then asked thousands of questions. And the answers are then put into a database, coded, cataloged, in order to be retrieved in response to questions asked by the user. This retrieval and question and mapping process is filled with potential pitfalls, but it is said to improve over time as the algorithm learns and as more questions are asked. I've seen the system in operation, and I'm sure some of you have as well. And what I've noticed is due to the natural variability of user language, the results are somewhat mixed. Failures to retrieve sensible answers can lead to a quick breakdown of the illusion of presence. And let's be very clear, this is an illusion. It is an illusion of a conversation with a survivor, something that many of us know from our childhoods can be a very deeply moving experience. Dan and Noah, who have been producing a hybrid journal, sort of article graphic novel on this, let's see if I can find it for you. They describe this illusion as the virtual human, and they say here, the uncanny valley, the closer rendering of the human gets to the photographic realism without reaching it, the more uncanny the representation remains. And here they sort of try to give a genealogy of this new technology by going all the way back to the animatronic Turk, the chess-playing Turk, and even Disney's animatronic Abraham Lincoln from 1964. But still, and while I don't necessarily approve of the approach the Dimensions takes, I certainly understand the impulse to create an opportunity for future generations to interact with the living witness. But the reality is this is not that. I would simply argue that it might have been better to engage with traditional testimony, which, while certainly framed by the recording process and methodology as well, does not try to create an illusion, but rather presents a historical artifact from the past and a recognition built in of life's finitude. It seems to me that this desire for infinity is driven by a kind of moral panic about what will happen to Holocaust memory once the end of the era of the living witness arrives. Apropos, as we saw in that first clip that I showed, this fear of the end of the era of the living witness is nothing new. Ellie is already warning us in 1982 that we need to act now before every of the survivors disappear. And this isn't anything new as well. If you go back to the historical commissions and you read some of the text of the historical commissions, the individuals involved with them, they were saying we have to do this now. It's already too late. Survivors are moving on with their lives in the DP camps. Or David Boder, who comes in 46 and says the same thing, I'm already too late. So this idea that the era of the living witness is always ending and always disappearing and always slipping from our grasp is nothing particularly new. Dimensions, however, seems driven by a desire to encase in amber this living witness, in the belief that a dialogue will somehow prevent memory from fading, like the memory of the Civil War, the World War I, once the veterans have died. This goal and the claim of a technology driven by angst seems to be further evidenced in the development of this technology into a full-fledged for-profit company, Storyfile, essentially a hive-off of this USC technology, which has the motto, making AI more human. And this company is run by Heather Smith, wife of former longtime USC Shoah Foundation director Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith is also one of the co-founders. And the business model seems to be, and I know this sounds a little bit cynical, now you too can capture your grandmother using this innovative technology and imprison her in a never-ending conversation long after she has shuffled off her mortal coil. To me, that all feels a little bit creepy. Still, and this should not be ignored, survivors participate willingly and actively in what is a taxing process of enduring thousands of questions over the course of several days of filming. They do so in the hope that sharing their experience would meet the educational needs of the next generation. In that sense, there are commonalities between the motivations of survivors today who give a Dimensions testimony and the survivors in the 1980s who gave traditional video testimony to the Fortunoff Video Archive. But here I believe is likely the primary similarity. Dimension does not feel like testimony to me. It's user-driven, not survivor-driven and centered, which is at least the Fortunoff Video Archive's method. It also doesn't have a beginning and an end, a framing in space and time. Rather, dimensions like the virtual survivors are free-floating. The narrative is not a cohesive story. That doesn't mean the testimony is in our archive or a cohesive story either. But it's really a disjointed collection of answers, whereas in our methodology, the best interview is one in which no questions are asked at all. So there really is quite a difference. Unlike the work of the Fortunoff Archive, which sought to provide a service of sorts, an act of solidarity, an opportunity for survivors to speak to an empathic listener first and foremost, it's unclear to me how this new technology serves the survivor or fulfills its purported educational mission. The adoption of this technology appears to be in service of something else, perhaps certain expectations of the future or how future generations will obtain information about anything, including the Holocaust. One could argue that the embrace of video technology by the Fortunoff Video Archive, as we heard in that clip, this groundbreaking new technology, was also in anticipation of the increasingly audiovisual age that we were already living in the 1970s. But in my opinion, Dimensions is a leap too far. It's an embrace of a cutting-edge technology that anticipates, I would argue, a fairly dystopian world. Not the world we live in now, but more a vision that's from Brazil, Minority Report, or Blade Runner. A world run by corporations, technology, and AI. A world in which this technology is ubiquitous. Okay, wait, maybe that is the age we're living in. I'm sorry. Still, rather than investing in an already existing source to encourage a critical understanding of history, how it's constructed, in pursuit of a more humanistic world, a world that we want to have, rather than a world that we think is inevitably coming our way, I would argue that that is unfortunately also the difference. Nevertheless, now that this technology exists, and what's more, it's installed in many Holocaust museums, USC seems to be working to build a pedagogical framing for it. That is, a method to engage with the virtual survivors with the help of some form of mediation. It seems like a positive step. I've heard that there's at times a docent leading a discussion with the virtual survivor, but that's far from the initial promise of a natural conversation. And it's strange to me that this thinking seems to be happening now, after the creation of the technology, as if the survivors need some kind of retrofitting. Sadly, a lot of that work to position the future of this technology was cut short when one of its main proponents, Kia Hayes, died suddenly. And I met Kia, and she's a delightful person, and while we may not have agreed on everything, it saddens me to think that she could not be here today to respond to my critiques, which honestly are meant in the spirit of intellectual exchange. Still, when it comes to digital tools like this, the practical pedagogical use case, I would argue, should come before the development of the technology itself. So after 20 years of working as an archivist and librarian, I have a greater source of Unbehagen than even this. The fear that the archive itself would become inert and sit on a shelf. After all, if we refuse to change with the times, this too, I can't allow the archive to be simply abandoned and wait for some future user to come and rediscover it. So we can't stand still or ignore the expectations of emerging scholars, often digital natives. But sometimes these researchers have unrealistic expectations about the capability of archives and archivists to adequately harness digitization and technology. Often it's not technology that's the problem, but more analog complications that prevent archives from exploiting technology. Lack of economic resources, or more commonly lack of human resources, rights limitations, poor cataloging and metadata, missing data, bad data, messy data, unstandardized data. All archivists know that the data munging in the beginning is the hard work that has to be done before the digitization can even begin. So we tend to forget that just like everywhere else, the world of archives is a story of haves and have-nots. So forget digitization, but many unique physical materials are in a desperate need of care. In particular, the audiovisual cultural heritage of the 20th and 21st century are primary records of this visual age. Film, radio, television, much of this audiovisual heritage has already been lost. And time is running out. Save the rest. So, if we want to encourage every generation to engage, to write, rewrite, reestablish the history and the meaning of the Holocaust, then we're going to have to stretch out of our comfort zone. We need to reconsider the traditional boundaries, physical and in terms of policy, to meet this new generation on its own terms, while not abandoning the underlying ethical impetus for our work. Otherwise, I fear the archive risks falling into obscurity, waiting in vain for someone to rediscover it. Then again, I'd suggest that there are other factors beyond the digital turn impacting whether or not a collection like Fortunoff would fall into obscurity. In retrospect, as we've discussed over the last 2 days, the high point of interest in the Holocaust and testimonies, video testimonies, seems to have peaked sort of in the 1990s. And since then, new areas of study, new politics and interests capture the attention of students and faculty. The current conflict in Gaza alone has radically redefined the space in which we work, how much space can, will, or should be given to Holocaust studies. When Hilberg wanted to write his epic work on the final solution, he was told not to do so. Perhaps something similar will start happening, albeit for quite different reasons. Moreover, maybe digitization itself is not the key we think it is to a wider audience. Is a digital archive like ours, now readily available at 200 sites worldwide, more visible, less obscure? After all, it's just one of 1,000 archives now online in a giant, increasingly complex and unnavigable tower of archival Babel. Are video testimonies recorded in the 1980s not more obscure rather than less obscure, when embedded in an overwhelming cacophony of digital content, in a world where 3.7 million videos are being uploaded to YouTube every day? 270,000 hours of material a day. So, and while digitization was essential for preservation and has allowed an exponential increase in access, it has challenged our traditional way of engaging with the collection and its researchers. Our longstanding effort to maintain the fidelity to the original unedited testimony has been a big part of our traditional ethical approach. What is missing in this new digital age is the personal connection between the researcher and the archivist. And I think Omar can probably attest to this. In the past, every researcher had to make the pilgrimage to New Haven to use the collection. There was almost always a physical meeting between the archivist and the researcher. For decades, this archivist was Joanne Rudolph, who had worked at the archive since 1984 and served as an interviewer on dozens of testimonies. She knew, and she still knows, this collection backwards and forwards. She organized all the affiliated tapings, and her expertise could be the difference between a successful research visit and an unsuccessful research visit. Sure, there's a gatekeeping element at work here, if you have a single point of contact, but this expertise cannot be integrated into a database. There's also this context. There's all this context and information that the researcher needs to understand what's happening in the testimony, information that's outside the actual video. Who were the interviewers? What were their motivations? When and why was the recording made? We also have a pre-interview process. In pre-interviews, where an archivist or an interviewer contacts the survivor a week in advance of the taping and asks a series of standard questions. We have complete pre-interview forms for almost all of our testimonies, and these include large amounts of information that may or may not make their way into the actual recordings. The interviewers use these pre-interviews to prepare themselves for the recording, to familiarize themselves with the witness's story, the names of the siblings, the parents' professions, the towns they lived in, the deportations, the ghettos and camps. But once you enter the interviewee has a mind of his own or her own. The interview can take directions unforeseen, and that's actually part of our methodology. So this certainly means that many topics will not be addressed, that might be addressed in the pre-interview forms. What do we do with these? How do we leverage this metadata? There are also large amounts of correspondence between the archive and certain interviewers and affiliated projects. Sometimes there's correspondence between the archive and specific witnesses before and after their recording. All of this information are active files, not open to research, and so locked away and inaccessible, but would provide enormous insight if we could find a way to make it available. We also have copies of photographs and documents that have been given to us by the survivors, and those are noted in the catalog record. But if you're in 1,000 miles away working with the collection digitally, you can't use those materials. And one of the most vexing aspects of the digital turn is that now we have this situation where thousands of individual testimonies as files are co-located in this large disparate database where they can be searched, sometimes with full-text transcripts, for minute historical details that might be addressed in just a few minutes of a much longer multi-hour life story. There's a growing risk, I fear, that digitization results in decontextualization, of losing the big picture, and also losing the small picture of an individual's entire life story. As research methods change, and technology does as well, and with the rise of DH, I worry that we are enabling, if not encouraging, a new kind of mild misuse of testimonial sources. By not encouraging the researcher to watch the complete testimony as a life story, as an audiovisual autobiography of a human being recounted to you, but rather as lines of content in a big pool of data that can be mined at will. Mining these pieces for use in scholarship as little testimonial sprinkles, brief nods to the first-person experience, is not, I would argue, exactly the integrated history for which scholars like Saul Friedlander have argued. And with that, I think I'd like to end, and we can instead switch to a sort of Q&A.
Great, thank you, Stephen, for your talk. My apologies for the two people who came in late. We had to start early to accommodate the reception change that was not intended. So thank you so much for being here, and apologies for any inconvenience. So we'll take some questions. So Ran, and then Marketa and David. I'll get you the microphone.
So Dory Laub famously had a big debate with a historian, whose name escapes me, about the issue of truth versus testimony, and this is something that you just brought it up at the end, right? I mean, if we don't have the documents, if you don't have the context, and we have the illusion, and also because this moral kind of, how do you say in English, tzivui, authority or commandment to listen to the survivors. And as historians in the room know, like, this is very, very, people's memory is not very reliable. So I wonder if there's any kind of countermeasures, especially because Dory Laub is very, controversial on the topic of believing survivors versus historical facts, whatever you call it. I wonder how is the archive is taking steps to counter this issue.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's an issue, to be quite honest. I think it's an issue that's been superseded by much research and writing since Dory Laub's this critique of Dory and this argument that he had about factuality and testimony. Nonetheless, from the very beginning, and it's not just Dory, it's Jeffrey as well, the goal of this project, first and foremost, was to provide a space that would allow survivors to speak about their experiences to an empathic listener. In that sense, it was an act of solidarity, and it wasn't an effort to seek, dig or mine them for factual information. It was about their experiences. And we didn't want to turn them into historians, right? However, that doesn't mean that that human memory, is somehow not useful for historical research. And in fact, Christopher Browning, Omer Bartov, many well-regarded scholars, have actually used testimonies from the collection in order to reconstruct events that are not accessible in other sources. However, you're absolutely right. But a good historian knows that you have to corroborate any evidence that you're looking at. Why would audiovisual testimony of survivors given 40 years after the fact be less accurate or reliable than Nazi German documents? You wouldn't approach a Nazi document without a certain amount of, let's say, critical source criticism. So it's the same thing. Corroborating these testimonies with other sources is essential for use in historical research, but there's absolutely an enormous amount of information in these testimonies that may not exist in other sources. Also, using massive numbers of testimonies where you can find experience in which you hear from many survivors, let's say of a small camp that there are no records from, and you hear the same experience over and over again, can lead you to make an educated guess that this is perhaps accurate. So I don't think this is really a controversial thing. I think it's a source like any other and needs to be triangulated. But that's not the point. The point is these sources, like diaries, like memoirs, provide us with something that government documents cannot, and that is the experience, what it feels like to be in that moment, in that place, in that time. We can only access that sort of experience through survivor testimony and memoirs.
Thank you for such an informative presentation. So my question is, there is a point, he says, you must tell, the survivors must tell. So I'm in the business of correcting life narratives. And it is so hard it's almost like forcing somebody to tell a story, either for scientific reason or just for the sake of even those who permit me to do it, even on my own family, I really struggle emotionally. So is that something ethical, moral, like how did they reflect on it, maybe from the experience? But because I see the importance, but what if somebody's not ready yet? Do you get them ready quickly,
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, but I'm going to look for you also, so we started this conversation.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And one of the reasons I show this clip is, remember, this is very, very early. This is 1982. The archive has just only been established. And so there's a lot in this film, and we only saw a very short clip. It's a 16-minute film. That is problematic or that changes over time, right? So this archive has existed for 45 years, and the methods and the approach and the individuals involved have shaped it. It wasn't just given, it didn't birth the methodology in 1979, 1988, 182. It evolves. And one of the most important things that was realized is that indeed any type of coercion or pressure on survivors to give testimony is unacceptable. And so that changes very rapidly. In the end, it becomes a sort of word of mouth where there's ads in the newspapers, the affiliates put ads in local Jewish newspapers or whatnot, saying, we're doing this, if you want, please contact us. And in fact, in many cases, children or grandchildren of survivors would contact us and say, my mother, my grandmother, she hasn't given testimony. She needs to give testimony. Can you please call her and convince her to come in and give testimony? And of course, the answer that we would always say is, no, we won't do that. You should leave your grandmother alone. And with exactly the realization that it is incredibly difficult to give testimony. Not everybody can or should. And it's not a cathartic experience. What we discovered over the years is that, of course, even the act of the pre-interview a week before can send survivors into a sort of darkness, right? Emotional difficulty, nightmares. And the same thing after the interview. It's not a cathartic experience. And so that is what we learned over time and definitely had an impact on the sort of policies and the way we approach.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this highly relevant and very fascinating lecture. I have a question regarding the dimensions of testimony, because, and this is relating back to my presentation earlier today, because the only, I don't know if this has changed, but to my understanding, the only non-Holocaust survivor that has been a part of this project is actually Xia Shuqin, who's the Nanjing Massacre survivor. And I really wonder if you have some insight into how this collaboration between the Shoah Foundation and a Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall and the private funder of this came about, and why was Mandarin included in this? I'm really trying to fight off the conspiracy theories in my head regarding the military connection into the foundation of this. I'll leave this to my mother. But yeah, if you have some insights into how this actually took place, thank you.
Okay, I don't. But you know who might is you would want to write to Noah Schenker and Dan Leppard, because they've been doing a lot of research on this. I don't know how much they've looked at some of these other testimonies, because I know they're now they've definitely moved out of the Holocaust survivor, exclusively Holocaust survivor subject area, and are doing other testimonies, but I don't know.
Yeah, so thank you, Stephen. It was a bit, it was moving because there were people there that I knew and was friends with, and they're gone now. So I want to say, first of all, these collections are incredibly important. I started working with the Steven Spielberg collection when it was still in the trailer in Hollywood. And I had 70 tapes of people from Buchach, from the town that I was writing on, right? And then the same in the Fortunoff Archive. And at the time, I mean, this is what you're saying, at the time, many of the most important historians, including, by the way, Saul Freelander, to this day, were against using this kind of material, as Ron was indicating. So Freelander was willing to use real-time documents. So if people wrote diaries, letters, but anything that was said after the event was ruled out. And I think it left a huge gap in how we try to understand the event, which doesn't mean that you can trust everything that a witness tells you 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, but it means that, as you were saying, if you combine it with all the other materials you can get, then several things happen. The most important of which is that you get a three-dimensional history. You can actually have what the perpetrators were saying, what bystanders were saying, what people experienced, and some events that would never otherwise exist. And my example of that, I just want to say this because I think it's important to understand that. So sure, you get the experience of being a victim and not only what the perpetrators were saying about it, but there's another thing. When I was researching anatomy of a genocide and I used about 250 such various types of testimonies, some events surfaced that did not exist at all in the archive. And what was interesting about those events, and I'll just give this one example, was in the area of Buchach, there was another town, Tłuste, and in that town there was a German army officer. And survivors or people hiding in the woods or were escaping from labor camps, which were being dismantled, heard that this officer was protecting Jews from local Ukrainians and other sort of soldiers who had deserted from the units, bandits, and so forth. And they streamed to that town, about 600 of them. And he told them that he would stay there until the Red Army arrived, and he would protect them from the locals, because the Gestapo, the SS, the Zipo had all disappeared already. They were now they didn't know his name, and there's no record of him in the archives. We only know about him from those people, and they could not have been lying about him, right? Because he saved them. And so this kind of event, which is actually sheds a good light on one good German who had protected 600 people, of whom half were killed later on by the Luftwaffe after the Red Army arrived. These kinds of moments, which are part of a genocidal reality, could only be recaptured from the accounts by those people, some written, some videotaped from completely different places. And so I think, what Jeffrey Hartman did, what later Spielberg did in his own way with pretty lousy interviewers, but a huge number of testimonies, right? over 50,000, was crucial. And it's still, most of this has not been used. There's vast amounts of testimonies, vast amounts of accounts. We don't need to worry about people having passed away. The material is there and it is not being used. And you can write more and more histories based on these accounts that are simply being neglected by historians who, to my mind, to some extent, for a long time had betrayed those people. We have to remember those people left testimonies and did interviews for one important reason. They wanted it to be part of the historical record. It wasn't for their grandchildren, it wasn't, they wanted it to be part of the history. Yeah, also for their grandchildren, but they wanted it to be part of the record. And historians have not really taken up that challenge. So digitize, keep it however you can, but make it available for historians, and you can tell aspects of what happened, not only in the Holocaust, but in other cases that otherwise you'll never find in the perpetrator's archives.
Thank you, Omar. That's why we've asked you to be on our honorary advisory board.
Okay, I'm not sure with my question I will be invited to be in the advisory board.
I'm not.
Do you think that the oldest interviews, you know the material very well, the interview made in May 1977 are closer to the truth than the one made 20 years later? Or is there not a naivety, when those people will give the first flesh of their...
Can I say something on that?
No, he will answer. And this is my impression after, of course I've used them, and I hate the video, and I love them, and we should all write about the way we react to and I want to strangle remember
the interviewers,
remember the quote by, and et cetera, and the way the people are described by the Spielberg archives, all Orthodox Jews. All Orthodox. You see people that are not Orthodox, etc., etc. But about this
belated and unbelated testimony and the quality of...
Because after the wave, the tsunami of Holocaust memory and Holocaust cultural products, etc., in the 80s and the 90s, we should study the way people give their testimony pre-Spielberg, Schindler's List, and after, etc.
This has been done,
that you could elaborate on? Or?
Yeah, for sure. So, well, first of all, I don't like, one of the things I've learned working with this collection, and I can't say I've learned a lot, but one of the things I've learned is it's very difficult to generalize about the survivors. There are certain common themes that pop up, but even, Omar, to say that the motivation was to give their testimony, to add to the historical record. That's certainly one motivation, but I would say there are many motivations. In fact, as many motivations as there are unique individuals in this collection. There are many common themes, but we have to approach this as unique individuals. That's kind of the point of an archive like this, is to provide to sort of push aside abstractions and think about these people as individuals. And I would say, though, that in terms of historical accuracy or in proximity to the events, absolutely not. I think some individuals, this is human memory, some individuals have a better memory than others. Some have a better memory immediately after or years later. Robert Kraft, who did a research really looked at hundreds and hundreds of testimonies and sort of looked at traumatic memory and how persistent it was, he found that, in fact, it doesn't matter decades after the fact, traumatic memory remains solid and persistent over time. So it really, it's more like what are survivors willing to talk about in 1946 versus 1956 versus 1979 versus 1994. So it's the environment around them that does indeed, of course, impact what they can or do remember or recount. So I don't think time is the key there, although certainly...
I said the shaping of art, more complex social demand that consciously or unconsciously the survivors would like.
Absolutely, there are key differences, but in terms of, let's say, historical accuracy or the amount of memory, time doesn't make a big difference, I think, or less a difference than one would expect.
So,
I just want to say one thing on that from my own experience, which was that, I mean, I remember one specific case of a young girl who testified in 1945 and then testified much later. And in 1945, you could guess that something was going on there, that she had been abused. But it was not explicit. She couldn't talk about it. And 20 or 30 years later, she could. And so part of, as you were saying, part of what happens is that there are moments that one can talk about a particular experience that immediately thereafter was impossible. And we have, yes, so the memory may be fresher. And another thing that I noticed, at least from what I was doing, I haven't seen as many as you, but that there are moments when people testify for the first time. If they testify over and over, if they go to schools all the time, then it becomes a sort of, there's a narrative. But if they testify for the first time 40 years later, something often happens. It feels like there was a black box and you touch it, and they tell you the story, and it's as if they have never told it before. And that's an extraordinary moment, right? And so it's not only a matter of how many years, but how often have you told it?
Okay, I just have a question. I mean, just following up from what you said, Henry Greenspan's work on retellings is the key kind of text and person to look at. But I have a kind of more technical, infrastructural issue. How did Todd Presner, who is a kind of practitioner of computational linguistics, both raise the question about dehumanization and then actually embark on that kind of process in which he said through his topic modeling, etc., but also the tension that you drew up between, technology platforms, not only for archives but museums, are the, main of, initiative and strategy of museums and archives today. You must have tech platforms associated with universities or their, through, corporate, software companies, etc. But how is this kind of tendency for aggregation of the archive also leading to disaggregation of the archive and the individual through this kind of dismantling of the individual's testimony and this kind of metadata that you talked about? So there's this kind of coexistence that you have to kind of live with, in a way, this accessibility issue.
Yeah, I mean, but we've always cataloged archival materials, regardless of audiovisual or analog, and so some amount of control, intellectual control, is a necessity, right? In order to make it searchable and usable and findable. And I think with the audiovisual materials, it's just that much more complicated a source, and so you could use a transcript that would be tied to the audiovisual code. It's just a slightly more complicated source, so you need different tools, perhaps, to engage with that.
But also what you said, the segmented, that people aren't watching the whole testimony.
That's the problem, but people weren't watching the whole testimony before. And people, if you give them a transcript, they'll only skim to the part of the testimony that they want to read anyway, right? So it's our goal to sort of, every digital humanities tool we've built aims to push the researcher back to the original testimony, right? If we have transcripts, we make it clear that transcripts are not the document. The archival document is the audiovisual recording, and we want to push you back into the full testimony, so that even if you're listening to a clip, you need to hear it in its context, because we truly believe if you do not listen to the entire testimony, you won't understand what you're actually listening to. You'll make mistakes. And then your other question about
Todd Presner.
Todd.
How is he resolving this tension?
I don't know if he is. I think that it can't be resolved. I would say that in Todd's case, something that I appreciate with the work he does is that he starts with a question, right? He starts with a research question that is valuable, and then he uses computational tools to answer that question. And here again, I think is quite a difference. I often see, we have these tools, we develop these tools. How can we apply them to testimony? And that, I think, is sort of putting the cart before the horse, right? We're taught, I think, comes from, I want to answer a question, and this computer program can help me do that. And in many ways, we have to also remember that what this type of computational analysis is just sort of a sped up version of what historians with a good deal of Sitzfleisch would normally do in an analog fashion, right? They'd sit around and they'd read testimony after testimony after testimony and look and think and write and make notes. So topic modeling is just what, Omar used to do at, New Haven when he'd come visit in an analog fashion. It's just sped up with the help of computers. So, and we also, so distance reading can also be a useful way to find patterns, right? And we do that in an analog world as well.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the difference is scale, I think.
Yeah.
Maria.
Thank you so much. I have a question about ethics of approaching video testimonies, and I think that it also continues this discussion you just had about full testimonies and approaching them in their entireties and so on. This is also about circulation and accessibility, and specifically I think about the context of video testimonies being exhibited in historical museums, because they always come there as fragments and not as full testimonies. And not only on the basis of curatorial decisions, but also they are subjected to, let's say, visitors' decisions, because usually they would be that you have to use headphones, and the testimonies either are looped or you have to start it and stop it. So it creates, in my experience, these strange situations in which you somehow enter this specific space, which is dedicated to approaching, listening to, viewing these video testimonies. You put your headphones on, you start it, and then you realize you don't have time to finish it if you want to follow with your visit. So you just have to stop it and somehow leave this witness alone in this, let's say, specific room, sometimes speaking to no one because all the visitors have already left. But at the same time, this is one of the rare moments in which, let's say, general public can approach video testimony as such. So I would love to know what's your comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a comment. I think you're absolutely right. You've hit the nail on the head. It's a compromise, right? Putting a fragment of a testimony into an exhibit space, and it's ironic that you asked me this because we're in the process of creating an exhibit of testimonies from the Fortunoff Video Archive to mark the 45th anniversary of the first taping in 1979. And the first challenge, of course, is how do you pick a testimony that is supposed to represent 4,500 individual voices? How do you pick 18 testimonies that somehow represent the breadth and depth, geographic, linguistic, experiential of the testimonies in this collection? It's absolutely impossible. It's impossible. So the only thing you can do in an exhibit setting is to indeed provide a fragment, but I think we have to accept that a fragmentary approach to telling the story of the Holocaust is actually the only thing we can really do. We can never tell the whole story. So if we accept that as a sort of limitation from the beginning and think that, okay, by showing this fragment in this space, we're providing an opportunity to do what the survivors had wanted, which is to share their story with a wider audience. So it is a compromise, and I think all your points are pretty valid.
Okay, so on that note, I want to say thank you so much, Stephen, for an excellent talk. Thank you, Omer, for sponsoring this conference, to Watson in the History Department, to Lily, and thank you everyone for attending. And please join us in the Watson foyer for the reception. Thank you.
Thank you so much.